Next speaker for today is Mr. Christopher Johnson, who is currently working as a space law advisor at the Secure World Foundation. He also is working as a law professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. He's also faculty member at the International Space University and a member of the International Institute of Space Law. Mr. Johnson, who previously worked as an attorney in New York, is a regular presenter and writer of space law and policy issues. He also represents Secure World Foundation at the United Nations. He holds a degree of Juris Doctor from the New York Law School and an advanced master's in air and space law from Leiden University. Today, he shall be shedding some light upon the policy aspects concerning sustainable lunar exploration vis-à-vis the exploitation of lunar resources for commercial and or scientific purposes. So we welcome you, Mr. Johnson. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction. If you can please confirm that you can hear me and see me.
Yes, you're audible. You're also visible.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I will start a timer and I'll try and keep my remarks to the allotted time span. So thank you for the introduction. I do teach international space law, and so I'm going to be speaking a bit today, as you said, about the normative framework for the moon, and hopefully we will focus a little bit on resource use, resource allocation, and governance of those resources. As I'm reflecting a bit more on the moon and kind of the geopolitical circumstances and context of it, I just realized, probably not the first person to realize it, that the moon is one place where no matter where you are on Earth, you can look up and see it. And I think that is what is unique about any other place that is within the sphere of human, consciousness and where we seek to govern. So it is an area outside of state territory, outside of state sovereignty, in a sense. But as far as an exploration destination and a destination that we can start to think about and come up with rules for it, essentially everyone can look up and say, this is where humanity is headed next. And I think that that's quite unique, and it puts us in, I would say, a good framework to think about the moon as a place where activities will be shared. So I say that all in the context of thinking about, and all of my remarks are thinking about the governance of and policy aspects, but more specifically governance of the moon. And it is a challenge to think about how we will do governance of the moon. The moon is 27% of the Earth's diameter, 1/50th of its volume, and 1/81st of its mass. So how do you come up with rules for such a specific location? And you can see from the background and from the previous presentations, it's a place which is physically different, quite physically different from all other areas that we have developed norms and rules for. Is it a third of the gravity? How do we come up with rules and norms and apply international law in a place which is so different from all those other areas which international law and which national laws apply to? So when I look at the history of lunar exploration, I see a few major states exploring the moon, first robotically and then with human crew. And I see sample return. I see it as a place where, at least for some period of time, here in the United States, we thought about the moon, and then we thought less about it, and we wanted to set our exploration sites elsewhere. And there was, this continuing, ongoing discussion about the moon or Mars or both, or moon first then Mars, or straight to Mars. And I will admit that I was in that camp of, oh yeah, we've been to the moon, let's go to Mars. But the arguments have, I would say, convinced me that the moon is more important as a near-term destination, and for a variety of reasons. I won't get into the scientific reasons, but in terms of the geopolitical reasons, it was always more in other nations besides the United States were always quite interested in going to the moon, and and wanted to make sure that that America was also wanting to go back to the moon. And that maybe wasn't the case under the Obama administration, which wanted to go to an asteroid or straight to Mars, and wasn't too enthused about the moon. But the rest of the world seemed to be persistent and wanted to go back to the moon. And so we have reoriented. The United States has reoriented with the Artemis program to again focus on the moon. And it is an interesting mix of lunar exploration and lunar development. So not just exploration and not just science, but actual industrial development, economic development, bringing the moon within the sphere of the world's economy, and seeing it as a place that is not just for quote unquote flags and footprints, but for actual economic developments, and making it in doing so in a sustainable way. So I've come back around to thinking about the moon as that next important place for all of those activities, and it certainly has with the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords, uh, received a whole lot more attention in the last 5 years than in the previous 5 years before that, or the previous 10 years, or in fact for many years. So we're looking back to go to the moon in a sustainable fashion and in a international fashion, in a way that has international buy-in and cooperation. And that is done um, for a variety of reasons. Some of those technological, some of those are policy rationales for going back to the moon in an international collaborative, cooperative sense. I'll mention briefly about that concept of soft power. And states want to amass and use their soft power. So anywhere you go in the world, you see people with NASA t-shirts, the space agency of the United States. And I think that NASA as a brand has tremendous power. And in fact, it's kind of a feather in the cap of America that it has that soft power of a um, civil, peaceful space program. No matter what you think of anything else that the U.S. has done, or your general opinions about the U.S., everyone, it seems, all over the world loves NASA. And so that has tremendous soft power, and America enjoys that soft power, that branding. And soft power is about branding and about people's perceptions of you as a state and as a culture. And are they enthused or happy or inspired by your national narrative or what you do? And I think NASA has that, a huge component of that. Um, Other nations uh, should seek to achieve that same type of soft power through their civil space programs, and to try and do things in space which impress the world and inspire the world, and and really bolster what that country's space activities are. I think it's quite interesting to think about space activities from the lens of their soft power opportunities. Um, Another element of soft power is about, let's see, shared interest and mutual problem solving. So if the U.S. is seeking to do things on the moon through Artemis and seeking to do things with other countries, it is doing so out of I would say, a shared interest, and that idea that we can do more together than any of us can do alone. So this is, I think, quite inspiring, and that's the spirit behind it is tied to International Moon Day, and tied to the idea that all the nations of the world, or many nations, can cooperate, can collaborate with each other to go back to the moon, whether it's with crewed missions or robotically, and they can do it for exploration goals, they can do it for science goals, they can do it for industrial development goals. Um, and all of that, it will be inspiring to their citizens and kind of increase their soft power and their prestige. So, I've been reading a bit about rationales to go to the moon, and very briefly, this guy Martin Rees has spoken about reasons to go back to the moon. And I'll just say that briefly so that then we can start thinking about the law and policy aspects of it. He says that investigating the formation and early history of the solar system, so a science goal, creating lunar habitats and possible bases for longer journeys. So that is exploration, it's science, but it's also industrial development, and it's also national prestige. Constructing astronomical observatories. So there's a science goal that may have some soft power and prestige elements of it. Discovering and utilizing the water buried in the lunar soil. So that's, of course, science, but it's also industrial development and economic. And then a little bit further along into the future, securing valuable lunar resources and lunar substances, most notably the rare isotope helium-3, or material for construction on the moon itself. So it sounds quite economic in purpose. And then quite distant in the future, sending lunar rocks into space to construct free-floating colonies that could support hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. So that's quite far into the future. But it seems as though that's exploration, but it's also industrial development. So there's some, I think, quite convincing rationales to return to the moon and conduct lunar activity, both with crewed missions and both with crewed missions and robotically. I'm saying all of these things, and I started my remarks with that idea that anybody on Earth can look up and see the moon and see this is a place where international cooperation and coordination can seek to achieve and develop and explore together collaboratively. To talk a little about the international space law and the norms and rules governing the moon. And I mean, firstly, when we start on this subject, we're talking about the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And I don't know how many lawyers we have in the audience, how many space lawyers we have in the audience, but make sure that you download your copy of the UN treaties from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, get the treaty booklet, sit down and read the treaty to understand what the current set of rules we have governing the moon. So when we look at space law, everything that all those obligations that exist in space law and all those prohibitions that exist in space law, they exist against and are balanced against Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which has that great right or freedom to access and use outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So in fact, the word use of the moon is in the very title of the treaty. It is in the preamble of the treaty, talking about the great prospects opening up before humankind. And Article 1 speaks of this great right of freedom of access and use. So all states have the sovereign right to explore space and use celestial bodies. They do not have to ask for permission from other states or from the United Nations or the UN Security Council, provided that they're in principle adhering to the rest of international law. They're free to go and explore and use outer space. So balanced against that great right that we have, codified, written into law by the Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, are a whole set of obligations, meaning you must undertake a certain activity, or prohibitions, meaning you must not undertake a certain activity. So the rest of the treaty has numerous obligations, to protect astronauts, to render assistance to the astronauts of other states, to register your space objects with the United Nations, to be internationally responsible for all of your national activities, i.e. internationally answerable for your national space activities, to be potentially liable for any damage which you cause in outer space. A further obligation to authorize and supervise all of your national space activities, including the activities of your non-governmental actors, and a further obligation to assure continuing compliance with the treaty of all of your national space activities. There are further obligations in Article 9 to pay due regard to the corresponding interests of other states parties to the treaty, a further obligation to adhere to principles of cooperation and mutual assistance. There is an obligation in Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty specific to the moon that your stations and installations shall be open to visitation by other states parties to the treaty on a basis of reciprocity. So we see a whole bunch of obligations. You must do this. You must undertake this. Then we see some prohibitions which exist in space law. Article 4 contains a lot of non-militarization, security-related aspects of lunar activities. Please sit and read Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and it says that the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and that stations, installations, and fortifications on the moon are prohibited, and that military maneuvers are prohibited on the moon. There's a slight carve out for military personnel who are conducting scientific activities are permitted, provided those scientific activities are peaceful in nature. But there's, I point to Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Outer Space Treaty to say that there is a heightened protections placed on the moon. So that's one of the great prohibitions which we see in the Outer Space Treaty. And then there is getting to this question about use of space resources. So Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says that the moon and other celestial bodies is not subject to national appropriation. So it is not, it's couched as a definition, and the grammar and the structure, the sentence structure of Article 2 is kind of interesting to think about. Outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So even if a state were to make a territorial claim on the moon, it has no legal effect because outer space is not subject to national appropriation. If they are to use places on the moon and use resources on the moon, for the purposes of Article 2, it has no legal effect because outer space is not subject to national appropriation. So the consensus, and it is not complete consensus with everyone in the world believing this, but all the important nations and I would say almost everyone, all the delegations at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. This consensus that has developed only over the past few years, probably 5 to 10 years, at least 5 years, is that while Article 2 prohibits national appropriation, states are allowed to use space resources, to use space mineral resources, to use those resources on the moon for a variety of purposes, and that activity does not rise to the level of national appropriation, and it does not rise to the level of being a violation of Article 2. It says that the moon is simply not subject to national appropriation. And in fact, the use of space resources is contained as a goal in national space programs and in the international, the ISEG, International Space Exploration Coordination Group, ISECG, their space exploration roadmap and their lunar roadmap for things that they want to do on the moon. So here, national space agencies have all agreed, and that's important, national space agencies representing their space agencies have agreed that they want to use space resources, and that therefore it is not, in their view, a violation of international law to use those space resources. So we are developing the rules for how we would use space resources and how any benefits would be shared. Essentially, I will say that, when we look to what I've discussed in the Outer Space Treaty, those principles of cooperation and due regard and mutual assistance and the visitation rights in Article 12, and the principle of non-appropriation, we don't get clear guidance. We get some guidance, but the specifics are not really there as to how we can use space resources. So we will look at the use of those space resources through a variety of lenses, whether they serve scientific goals, whether they serve economic goals, whether they serve multiple of those goals. And I believe that we will be able to use space resources to assist all those exploration goals and economic development goals. The problem is that there will be rivalrous locations on the moon and rivalrous resources that people will want to get there first. We do not want to have a gold rush or a land grab on the moon. I don't think that we will, because it is very difficult to get there and very slow going, and it will be very obvious to other nations if one nation is seizing all the best places, and there will be international consequences. Like I was talking about soft power before, uh, no nation would want to be seen as the state which is seizing all the best places on the moon for itself. Um, and then lastly, I will just say, I will wrap up that everything that we're talking about here, when we look at it from a political lens, when we look at it from a historical lens, these are ambitions that we have on the moon. It is not certain that any of these things will happen. It is not set in stone that this is our future. These things are not bound to happen. We have to make them happen. We have to assist them happening. And we will do so, as I said, in an internationally cooperative fashion, with shared interests and mutual problem solving. So the Americans get better when other countries are also doing the same activities. Everyone does better when we coordinate and assist each other in these activities. So with that, I have given an overview of the law applicable to lunar activities at this point in time, as of 2022, with the idea that there's much law to go, to yet still be developed. And I wanted to stress that idea about shared interest in mutual problem solving through soft power, and as a rationale for soft power. And lastly, that, as I said, these things are not certain to happen, but we have to make them happen. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. I see there's a number of questions, and we will get to those questions in a little bit, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I believe you can see the questions. Do you want me to read them for you?
No, I'll have a look at them. All right, so the first question, do you think we'll have a polycentric governance model for the moon? Yes, definitely. Especially for lunar resources. Well, one thing is that the current space law that we have right now makes a little bit of differentiation between low Earth orbit and the geosynchronous orbit, but it treats celestial bodies and space essentially in the same fashion. And we have the Outer Space Treaty and everything and it says in the Outer Space Treaty, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So we have the same regime, the same legal regime for the moon as one complete sphere. And the moon is big. We may need to come up with specific rules for specific activities or specific locations on the moon. It could be that there could be a far side of the moon arrangement for areas on the far side of the moon. There could be a specific arrangement for lunar resources at the poles. There will, it stands to reason that the law, which started off as vague and all-encompassing, becomes more specialized and fragmented, and that would be a good thing if it becomes more concretized and specific. But in terms of polycentricity, yes, there's the idea that will happen, that the United Nations will try and develop norms of the moon. At the same time, national space agencies will be developing norms of the moon. I'm thinking about the Artemis Accords, which has, I think it's 19 or 20 states which are party to the Artemis Accords. So there's a specific subset of international space law, the Outer Space Treaty regime, and yet there's also these Artemis Accord partner countries. Although largely the same regime in the Artemis Accords really just reiterates what's in the Outer Space Treaty. And there will also be actions taken by national governments specific to themselves. So the US government with its own national space legislation that governs US entities and only US entities. And if you want to do things on the moon as an American national space activity for the purposes of Article 6, as a national space activity, this set of rules will apply to you. And in fact, governance efforts will be made at various levels. Governance efforts will be made, and this is really into studying the life cycle of norm development. But governance efforts will be made at the United Nations. They will be made at the national level. They will be made at the subnational level. The scientific community will be developing rules and norms that suit it. Yeah, all of these will be, in one sense, competing, but in another sense, hopefully doing so, collaboratively. So yeah, I see polycentricity. Another question was, actually, your earlier question was with regard to polar resources, polycentric governance, especially with regard to polar resources. I hope not, because we want to have only one regime for a particular, phenomena, polar resources. Let's only have one set of rules for that. But it will be competition for who develops those rules and norms. Do you think, relatedly, do you think all the stakeholder nations and other actors would be able to agree on a abundance/scarcity of lunar polar resources and therefore their renewability and fair use as increasingly more missions and campaigns launch? Well, renewability of lunar resources, I don't think that that's the case. But they would have to agree on a model which is based on the finite nature of lunar resources and probably the difficulty in accessing them and the requirements of Article 2 and of Article 9 due regard, and Article 12 visitation rights, and probably Article 1, 2 about shared benefit and peaceful purposes. All those would, I guess, inform it. I think that's all the questions that I have so far.
So
no.
we do have one more.
Yeah. Do the Artemis Accords provide adequate and detailed provisions classifying what can and cannot be allowed near such regions? No, they do not. The Artemis Accords are general in nature, and you read them all the way through. They say that when it comes time to actually do cooperative activities under the Artemis program, that specific provisions will be developed and specific arrangements will be developed on a mission-by-mission basis. So, I would say 90% of the Artemis Accords are just a reiteration of what's already in the Outer Space Treaty, with a little bit of clarification and innovation on space resources, on safety zones, on interoperability and transparency. But really, the more detail will have to be worked out on a mission-specific basis. And I think that was it.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was asking if there are any space lawyers here in the meeting. So I'll be going to study Air and Space Law this year at McGill. And
Okay.
I would be asking this for myself and for everyone else over here. Would you like to recommend any good law books or space law books as a primer, for beginners?
Well, I mean, honestly, just first get a copy of the treaties, download a copy of the treaties. My organization, Secure World Foundation, publishes, we're an NGO, a non-governmental organization. So we're not in it to make money. We're not a corporation. We're a non-governmental organization. We put out a free book called The Handbook for New Actors in Space that is a good primer because it has, international space law is chapter 1, national space law and policy is chapter 2, and then, operations in chapter 3. The PDF for that is free online. It's a couple hundred pages, and but it's general in nature, and I think that's a good starting point. And then after that, space law textbooks after that can get a little bit more expensive. All of them are quite good. This one is, I teach with this one, Space Law, Lyle and Larson, but this is quite expensive. And that's what you would get if you're, then just, for doing research. But I would say start off with the Handbook for New Actors in Space, I'd say.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson, for joining us and enlightening us about the space law aspects of lunar exploration.
Thank you so much.